in the heart of America's most vibrant and dangerous neighborhood, where jazz music filled the air and danger lurked around every corner, one young man would rise from absolute nothing to become the most feared and respected figure in Harlem's criminal underworld. Picture this: a 22-year-old with a dangerous reputation, a sharp mind, and an unbreakable will, standing at the crossroads of history during one of the most explosive years America had ever seen. This is not just a story about crime or violence. This is the story of how Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known to the world as Bumpy Johnson, took control of Harlem streets in 1928 and changed the face of organized crime forever. Before the mafia families knew his name, before he became a legend whispered about in dark alleys and smoky clubs, before he shaped the destiny of an entire community, he was just a young man with everything to prove and nothing to lose. What happened in that single year would echo through decades of American history, transforming a neighborhood, challenging the most powerful gangsters in New York City, and creating a legacy that would never be forgotten. This is the story of ambition, survival, power, and the making of a legend. Bumpy Johnson was not born into power or privilege. He entered the world on October 31st in 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina, a place where being born black meant being born into a system designed to keep you down. His real name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, but nobody would remember that name because the streets would give him a new identity entirely. Charleston was a city still drowning in the aftermath of slavery, where Jim Crow laws controlled every aspect of daily life, where a black child had almost no chance of escaping poverty, and where dreams were crushed before they could even form. Bumpy's family struggled like everyone else around them, working hard jobs for little pay, living in neighborhoods that lacked basic resources, and facing constant reminders that they were considered less than human by the society around them. But even as a young boy, Bumpy Johnson was different. He carried himself with a confidence that seemed impossible given his circumstances, and he refused to bow his head to anyone, no matter what the consequences might be. This defiance would become his trademark, but in the South during those years, it was also extremely dangerous. The young Ellsworth developed a large bump on the back of his head during childhood, a deformity that other children mocked mercilessly, and that would eventually give him his famous nickname. Instead of hiding from the teasing or letting it break his spirit, Bumpy wore it like a badge of honor, turning what others meant as an insult into an identity that would one day strike fear into the hearts of grown men. But Charleston was suffocating for someone with Bumpy's spirit and ambition. The racial violence was constant and brutal, the economic opportunities were non-existent, and the future looked exactly like the past with no hope for change. When Bumpy was still a teenager, his family made the decision that would change everything. They would leave the South behind and join the Great Migration, that massive movement of African Americans fleeing the oppression of the South for the promise of better lives in the North. They packed whatever they could carry and headed to New York City, to a neighborhood that was becoming the capital of Black America, a place called Harlem. When Bumpy Johnson arrived in Harlem, he was just a teenager, but he was arriving at exactly the right moment in history. Harlem in the early 1920s was exploding with energy, creativity, and possibility. This was the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance, when black culture was flourishing like never before, when jazz musicians were creating new sounds that would change music forever, when writers and artists were producing work that demanded the world pay attention. The streets were packed with people who had come from all over the South, all seeking the same thing: freedom and opportunity. Bumpy walked those streets with wide eyes, taking in the brownstone buildings, the nightclubs that stayed open until dawn, the street vendors selling food that smelled like home, and the energy that seemed to pulse through every block. This was nothing like Charleston. Here, black people owned businesses, performed in theaters, walked with their heads held high, and created their own world within a world. But Bumpy quickly learned that Harlem was not the paradise it appeared to be from a distance. Beneath the music and the culture, Harlem was a neighborhood struggling with severe problems. Poverty was everywhere despite the glamorous clubs and cultural achievements. Most families lived crammed into tiny apartments with terrible conditions, paying high rents to landlords who refused to maintain their buildings. Jobs were still hard to find because white employers discriminated openly, and the jobs that were available paid barely enough to survive. Prohibition had turned America into a nation of criminals, where alcohol was illegal but everyone still wanted to drink, creating a massive underground economy controlled by gangsters and criminals. Harlem became a major center for illegal activities including bootlegging, gambling, drug dealing, and prostitution. The neighborhood was divided into territories controlled by different gangs and crime organizations, and violence could erupt at any moment over disputes about money, territory, or respect. For a young man like Bumpy who arrived with no money, no connections, and no legitimate prospects, the criminal underworld was not just tempting, it was practically the only option available. Bumpy Johnson did not become a criminal mastermind overnight. He started at the very bottom, running small errands for local gangsters, watching everything, learning how the streets really worked. He was smart enough to understand that success in this world required more than just toughness or a willingness to use violence. It required understanding people, building relationships, knowing when to fight and when to negotiate, and most importantly, earning respect from those above you and fear from those below you. Bumpy became associated with various small-time criminals and street gangs, taking whatever work he could get, proving himself reliable and fearless. He got into fights regularly, both to defend himself and to build his reputation as someone who could not be intimidated or pushed around. That bump on his head that had been mocked in childhood now became memorable in a different way, making him instantly recognizable on the streets. During these early years, Bumpy caught the attention of some more established criminals who recognized something special in the intense young man. He was invited into bigger operations, given more responsibility, and slowly began climbing the ladder of Harlem's criminal hierarchy. But Bumpy was learning something crucial during this period. He noticed that most criminals were short-sighted, thinking only about the immediate score, never planning for the long term, and treating the community around them with complete disregard. He saw gangsters who terrorized their own neighborhoods, who preyed on poor families, who brought nothing but misery to the people who lived around them. Bumpy began developing a different philosophy. He believed that controlling a neighborhood meant protecting it as much as profiting from it. He understood that real power came from having the community on your side rather than living in constant fear of revenge or betrayal. This was revolutionary thinking in the criminal world, and it would become the foundation of everything Bumpy Johnson would build. To understand how Bumpy Johnson took over Harlem in 1928, you have to understand what Harlem was in that specific moment. The year 1928 was near the peak of the Roaring Twenties, that wild decade after World War I when America seemed drunk on prosperity, jazz music, illegal alcohol, and the feeling that anything was possible. Harlem had become the place where black culture was not just surviving but thriving and leading. The Cotton Club was packing in crowds every night, though ironically it only allowed white customers to watch black performers. The Savoy Ballroom was the place where new dance crazes were born. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and other brilliant writers were creating literature that captured the black experience in ways never done before. Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong were making music that would influence generations to come. On the surface, Harlem looked like success, like the promised land that all those migrants from the South had dreamed about. But underneath this glamorous surface, Harlem was a powder keg of tension, inequality, and criminal competition. The same white society that enjoyed black entertainment still enforced strict segregation and discrimination. The police treated Harlem residents with brutality and contempt, often working with white criminals while cracking down hard on black ones. The economic prosperity of the Roaring Twenties barely reached the average Harlem family, who still struggled with unemployment, poor housing, and limited opportunities. Into this gap stepped organized crime, providing both services that people wanted and jobs that desperate people needed. By 1928, Harlem's criminal underworld was becoming increasingly organized and increasingly violent. Different factions were fighting for control of the most profitable illegal activities. White mobsters from downtown Manhattan were trying to muscle in on Harlem's black neighborhoods, believing they could take over the territory and its profits. Local black gangs were fighting each other over territory and business. It was complete chaos, and into this chaos walked a 22-year-old Bumpy Johnson, ready to make his move. 1928 was the year when Bumpy Johnson went from being just another street criminal to becoming a major power in Harlem. But his rise did not happen because of one single event or one big score. It happened through a combination of strategic thinking, calculated violence, personal charisma, and perfect timing. Bumpy had spent several years building relationships with key figures in Harlem's underworld, and by 22 years old, he had earned a reputation as someone who was absolutely fearless, extremely smart, and completely trustworthy to those who were loyal to him. He understood that the fragmented state of Harlem's criminal world was weakness, that the constant fighting between different black gangs only made it easier for white mobsters to come in and take over. Bumpy began talking to other young criminals about the need for unity, about working together instead of against each other, about building something bigger and more powerful than the small-time operations they were running. This was dangerous talk because many established criminals saw any attempt at organization as a threat to their own power. But Bumpy was persistent and persuasive. He started forming alliances, bringing together small gangs and independent operators under a loose organization that could coordinate activities and present a united front against outside threats. He offered protection to local businesses in exchange for payments, but unlike many criminals, he actually provided real protection, making sure that those who paid were genuinely safe from robbery and violence. This earned him loyalty from business owners who saw him as genuinely different from typical thugs. Bumpy also began enforcing a code of conduct among the criminals who worked with him. There would be no robbing poor families in the neighborhood, no violence against innocent people, and no dealing with anyone who disrespected the community. This was almost unheard of in the criminal world, but it was brilliant strategy because it meant that ordinary residents of Harlem began to see Bumpy not as an enemy but almost as a protector. But respect and loyalty alone were not enough to control Harlem streets. Bumpy Johnson also had to be willing to fight, and fight he did with a ferocity that shocked even hardened criminals. Throughout 1928, Bumpy was involved in numerous confrontations with rival gangs and criminal organizations. Some of these were settled through negotiation and shows of strength, but others ended in violence. Bumpy developed a reputation for being absolutely ruthless with anyone who challenged him or threatened his organization. He was not the biggest or strongest fighter, but he was fearless and unpredictable, willing to take risks that others would never consider. Stories began spreading through Harlem about the young man with the bump on his head, who had faced down groups of armed men without backing down, who had walked into rival territory alone to deliver messages, who never forgot a slight, and always repaid loyalty with loyalty and betrayal with swift punishment. The most significant challenge came from white mobsters who were trying to expand their operations into Harlem. These were connected men, backed by powerful crime families from downtown Manhattan and other parts of New York, with more money, more guns, and more political connections than Bumpy could possibly match. Many people thought it was insane for a young black man to resist these organizations, that he should accept whatever deal they offered and be grateful to be allowed to operate at all. But Bumpy Johnson refused to bow down. He understood something that many others missed. Harlem was his home territory, and that gave him advantages that outsiders could never match. He knew every street, every building, every alley. He had relationships with residents who would warn him about strangers or police movements. He could move through the neighborhood invisible while outsiders stood out immediately. Bumpy used these advantages brilliantly, striking at white mobsters' operations in Harlem, disrupting their businesses, and making it clear that operating in his territory would be expensive and dangerous. As 1928 progressed, Bumpy Johnson's control over significant portions of Harlem became undeniable. He had successfully unified many of the independent black criminals and small gangs under his influence. He had established profitable operations in gambling, bootlegging, and other illegal activities. He had fought off challenges from rivals and forced white mobsters to recognize that they could not simply take over Harlem without his cooperation. At just 22 years old, Bumpy had accomplished what many older and more established criminals had failed to do. He had brought a level of organization and discipline to Harlem's underworld that had never existed before. But what made Bumpy truly different from other criminals was how he saw his relationship with the community around him. Bumpy Johnson lived in the same neighborhood where he operated, walked the same streets as ordinary residents, and never forgot where he came from. He made sure that his organization provided real benefits to the community, not just extracting money from it. When families were being evicted and had nowhere to go, Bumpy sometimes intervened with landlords or provided money to help them stay in their homes. When local businesses were being harassed by criminals or corrupt police, Bumpy offered protection. During the harsh winter months, his organization distributed food and coal to families who were struggling. None of this was pure charity. Bumpy understood that these actions built loyalty and made residents less likely to cooperate with police or rival criminals. But it was also genuine connection to the community, a recognition that his power depended on the people around him. This created a complicated relationship where many Harlem residents knew Bumpy was a criminal, but also saw him as someone who genuinely cared about the neighborhood in ways that legitimate authorities never did. But becoming a major criminal figure at 22 years old came with enormous costs that Bumpy Johnson would pay throughout his life. The violence that had helped him rise to power also marked him permanently. He carried scars from knife fights and bullet wounds, physical reminders of how close he had come to death on multiple occasions. He lived constantly looking over his shoulder, knowing that rivals, ambitious underlings, or law enforcement could come for him at any time. The relationships in his life were complicated and often damaged by the violence and illegality that surrounded him. Trust became a rare and precious commodity when betrayal could mean death. Bumpy also drew the attention of law enforcement, and being a successful black criminal in 1920s America meant facing a justice system that was stacked against him from the start. Throughout 1928 and the years that followed, Bumpy would be arrested numerous times. Some charges were legitimate based on his actual criminal activities, but others were clearly exaggerated or fabricated by police who wanted to remove him from the streets. The criminal justice system treated black defendants far more harshly than white ones, giving longer sentences for similar crimes and providing far fewer legal protections. Bumpy would spend significant portions of his life in prison because of this systematic inequality. But remarkably, even imprisonment could not break his power or influence. Bumpy maintained his connections and control even from behind bars, communicating with his organization through visitors and smuggled messages, and sometimes his time in prison actually enhanced his reputation as someone who could survive anything. The legend of Bumpy Johnson was growing beyond just Harlem, spreading through the entire criminal underworld of New York and beyond. The impact of Bumpy Johnson taking control of Harlem streets in 1928 extended far beyond just criminal activities. He changed the fundamental power dynamics of the neighborhood in ways that would influence it for decades to come. Before Bumpy's rise, black criminals in Harlem were often scattered, disorganized, and ultimately subordinate to white criminals who saw Harlem as territory to exploit. Bumpy proved that a black man could not only survive in the criminal underworld, but could actually dominate it, controlling territory and operations that white mobsters wanted for themselves. This was revolutionary in an era when black people were expected to accept subordinate positions in every aspect of society. Bumpy showed that through intelligence, courage, organization, and ruthlessness, those power structures could be challenged and overcome. His approach to criminal enterprise also set a template that others would follow. The idea of the neighborhood crime boss who acts as both predator and protector, who extracts money but also provides services and security, who operates outside the law but follows his own code, became a recurring figure in black urban neighborhoods across America. This was not entirely positive because it meant that criminal figures sometimes filled the gap left by legitimate institutions that failed to serve black communities adequately. But it reflected the reality that in neighborhoods where police provided harassment rather than protection, where banks refused to loan money, where legitimate businesses would not invest, illegal economies, and the people who controlled them became powerful forces. Bumpy Johnson did not create this situation, but he understood it brilliantly and used that understanding to build power. By the end of 1928, Bumpy Johnson was not just a Harlem figure, but was becoming connected to wider criminal networks throughout New York and beyond. His success had earned him respect from some of the most powerful mobsters in America, people who had initially dismissed him as just another black street criminal. Bumpy began working with various organized crime families, handling operations in Harlem that they could not manage themselves because they lacked his connections and understanding of the black community. This was a delicate balance because Bumpy had to cooperate enough to avoid being killed by more powerful organizations, but also maintain enough independence to keep control of his own territory. He navigated this balance brilliantly, forming partnerships when they benefited him, pushing back when others tried to take advantage, and always keeping his own organization strong enough to be dangerous to anyone who crossed him. One of the most important relationships Bumpy would develop was with Stephanie St. Clair, a remarkable woman known as the Queen of Numbers who controlled much of Harlem's illegal lottery operations. The numbers game was hugely popular in black neighborhoods because it offered ordinary people a chance to win money with small bets, and it generated enormous profits for those who controlled it. Stephanie St. Clair was one of the most powerful criminals in Harlem, and her alliance with Bumpy created a formidable partnership. Together, they fought against attempts by white mobsters, particularly Dutch Schultz and later Lucky Luciano, to take over Harlem's numbers operations. The battles over the numbers game would define much of Harlem's criminal history in the 1930s, but the foundations were laid in 1928 when Bumpy was establishing himself as a major power. Who was Bumpy Johnson beyond the violence and criminal activities? The people who knew him described a complex man who defied easy categorization. He was extremely well-read, educating himself constantly despite having limited formal schooling. He loved discussing politics, history, and philosophy, and could quote literature and poetry. He dressed impeccably, always appearing in expensive suits and maintaining an appearance of dignity and respectability even while engaging in illegal activities. He was known for having a sharp sense of humor and being capable of great charm when he chose to be. But he was also capable of shocking violence, and he never showed mercy to anyone he considered an enemy or a traitor. This combination of culture and brutality, of genuine community concern and ruthless criminality, made Bumpy Johnson fascinating to people both in his own time and in the decades since. Bumpy was also deeply shaped by the racial dynamics of his era. He lived during a time when lynching was still common in the South, when race riots could destroy entire black neighborhoods, when the Ku Klux Klan was powerful and mainstream, when black Americans faced systematic oppression in every aspect of life. This context helps explain why someone as intelligent and capable as Bumpy turned to crime rather than legitimate pursuits. The legitimate world offered him almost nothing, closing doors based on his race before he even had a chance to prove himself. Crime offered opportunity, power, and a chance to build something in a society that was designed to prevent him from building anything at all. Bumpy was also very conscious of race throughout his life, seeing his battles with white criminals as not just business disputes, but as racial struggles about who would control black neighborhoods and profit from black communities. Even in 1928, when Bumpy Johnson was just beginning his rise to power, people were already telling stories about him that would become the foundation of his legend. They talked about his fearlessness, his intelligence, his style, and his absolute refusal to back down from anyone no matter how powerful. They told stories that were sometimes exaggerated or completely made up, but which captured something true about who Bumpy was and what he represented. In the jazz clubs and speakeasies of Harlem, his name was spoken with respect and fear. On the street corners where men gathered to gamble and talk, Bumpy Johnson was already becoming a mythical figure, larger than life. This was partially calculated by Bumpy himself, who understood that reputation was as important as actual power in the criminal world, but it also reflected genuine fascination with someone who seemed to embody both the possibilities and the dangers of Harlem during that explosive era. The year 1928 was also significant in broader American history. The country was about to plunge into the Great Depression, though nobody knew it yet. The prosperity and optimism of the Roaring Twenties were about to come crashing down, bringing unemployment, poverty, and desperation that would transform America. Prohibition would continue for several more years, keeping organized crime profitable and powerful. Harlem would continue its cultural renaissance while also struggling with increasing social problems. And through all of these changes, Bumpy Johnson would remain a constant presence, adapting to new circumstances but never losing his position of power. The foundation he built in 1928 proved strong enough to survive economic collapse, changing criminal markets, imprisonment, and challenges from some of the most powerful mobsters in America. Bumpy Johnson operated according to a code that governed how he conducted his criminal activities. This code was not written down but was understood by everyone who worked with him or dealt with him. The code emphasized loyalty above almost everything else. If you were loyal to Bumpy, he would protect you, support your family if you were imprisoned, and ensure you were treated fairly within the organization. But if you betrayed him, punishment was swift and severe. The code also emphasized respect, both showing it and demanding it. Bumpy treated people with respect regardless of their position, speaking politely to street vendors and club owners just as he would to powerful mobsters, and he expected that same respect in return. Disrespect was one of the quickest ways to earn his anger. The code included rules about violence, which was seen as a tool to be used strategically rather than randomly. Violence was acceptable against rivals, against threats, and against those who broke the rules, but it was not to be used against innocent people or in ways that brought unnecessary attention from police. Another important aspect of Bumpy's code was his attitude toward drugs, which would become increasingly significant in later decades. In the 1920s, marijuana and cocaine were already present in Harlem, but heroin had not yet become the devastating force it would later become. Bumpy's attitude toward drugs was complicated and would evolve over time, but he generally opposed hard drugs because he saw how they destroyed individuals and communities. This put him at odds with some criminals who saw drugs as just another profitable business. His resistance to the drug trade was not absolute, but it was another way in which Bumpy tried to balance being a criminal with maintaining some connection to positive values and community welfare. This complicated moral position was central to understanding Bumpy Johnson. He was definitely a criminal who broke laws, used violence, and profited from illegal activities. But he was not simply a predator who took everything and gave nothing back. He saw himself as part of the community, bound to it by complex ties of identity, loyalty, and mutual obligation. Behind the public figure of Bumpy Johnson were important relationships with women who influenced him, supported him, and sometimes challenged him. His wife Mame Johnson would become one of the most important people in his life, though their relationship developed after 1928. But even during his early rise to power, women played significant roles in Bumpy's world. Stephanie St. Clair was not just a business partner, but someone Bumpy deeply respected as an equal in a world dominated by men. She was older than Bumpy and had already established her criminal empire before he rose to prominence. Their relationship was complex, possibly romantic at some points, definitely based on mutual respect and shared interests. Stephanie taught Bumpy important lessons about organization and about fighting against powerful enemies. She was as fearless as any man in the criminal underworld, and her willingness to stand up to white mobsters who tried to take over her territory influenced Bumpy's own confrontational approach. There were other women in Bumpy's life during the 1920s as well, including performers, business owners, and women involved in various aspects of the underground economy. Some of these relationships were romantic, others were professional, and some were simply friendships. But what is notable is that Bumpy treated women with more respect than was typical for criminals in that era. He listened to their advice, protected them when they needed protection, and recognized their intelligence and capabilities. This was partly because Bumpy was smart enough to see talent and value it regardless of gender, but it also reflected the unique culture of Harlem, where black women often had more independence and power than in other communities. Women ran successful businesses, performed in clubs, wrote literature, and created art. The culture of the Harlem Renaissance celebrated black womanhood in new ways, and Bumpy was influenced by that culture even as he operated in the criminal underworld. Every single day of 1928 brought dangers that could have ended Bumpy Johnson's rise before it really began. The criminal world he operated in was absolutely ruthless. People were killed regularly over disputes about money, territory, or respect. Betrayal was common because the rewards for selling out a rival or even a partner could be substantial. The police were a constant threat, and getting arrested meant facing a justice system that was designed to crush black defendants. Beyond legal threats, the violence of the street was unpredictable and ever-present. A rival could attack at any moment. An ambitious underling might decide to take power by eliminating the current leader. A simple misunderstanding could escalate into deadly confrontation. Bumpy survived this environment through a combination of factors, including his reputation for being too dangerous to attack, his network of loyal associates who watched for threats, his careful planning and strategic thinking, and probably a significant amount of luck. Bumpy also had to navigate the complicated racial dynamics of New York's criminal underworld. The Italian mafia families were growing more powerful and organized throughout the 1920s, developing into the sophisticated criminal enterprises that would dominate organized crime for decades. These families generally viewed black criminals as inferior, as small-time operators who could be useful for handling certain territories and activities, but who should ultimately answer to white authority. Jewish gangsters like Arnold Rothstein and Dutch Schultz were also major powers who had to be dealt with carefully. Bumpy's strategy was to demand respect and equal treatment, to demonstrate through actions that he was as smart, tough, and capable as any white criminal, and to make it clear that trying to simply dominate him would be more costly than treating him as a legitimate power. This was a dangerous game because many white criminals were backed by larger organizations and had more resources, but Bumpy played it brilliantly, earning genuine respect from some and at least wary acknowledgement from others. By the end of 1928, the transformation was complete. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, the young man who had arrived in Harlem just a few years earlier with nothing but anger and ambition, was now Bumpy Johnson, one of the most powerful criminals in Harlem. He controlled significant territories, commanded the loyalty of numerous followers, had established profitable criminal enterprises, and had earned respect and fear from both allies and enemies. At just 22 years old, he had accomplished more than most criminals achieved in entire lifetimes. But this was not an ending. It was a beginning. The foundation Bumpy built in 1928 would support a criminal career that would last for decades. He would face imprisonment multiple times, but would always emerge to reclaim his position. He would fight wars against some of the most powerful mobsters in America and would survive when others fell. He would see Harlem transform through the Great Depression, World War II, the post-war years, and into the Civil Rights era. And through all those changes, Bumpy Johnson would remain a constant presence. The impact of what Bumpy accomplished in 1928 extended far beyond his personal success. He changed the nature of organized crime in Harlem, proving that black criminals could control their own territories and did not have to simply be subordinate to white criminal organizations. He established a model of community-connected criminality that would be imitated by others. He became a symbol within the black community, a complicated symbol certainly, but one that represented resistance to white domination and achievement of power in a society that tried to deny black people any power at all. Young black men in Harlem and beyond would look at Bumpy Johnson and see possibility, see someone who came from nothing and built an empire through intelligence and courage. This was not a positive message in many ways because it romanticized criminal life, but it reflected real frustrations and real lack of opportunities in legitimate society. Even during his own lifetime, Bumpy Johnson became the subject of myths and exaggerations that made it hard to separate fact from fiction. Stories about his toughness, his intelligence, his style, and his exploits grew with each retelling. Some people claimed he was a cold-blooded killer who personally murdered dozens of people. Others insisted he was a Robin Hood figure who robbed from criminals to give to the poor. Some said he was connected to every major crime in Harlem. Others claimed he was actually running legitimate businesses and was persecuted by police who could not accept a successful black man. The truth was more complicated than any of these simple narratives. Bumpy was definitely a criminal who engaged in illegal activities and used violence when he thought it necessary. He was also someone who maintained genuine connections to his community and followed his own code of conduct. He was ruthless with enemies but loyal to friends. He was intelligent and strategic, but also capable of emotional reactions and violence. The mythology around Bumpy Johnson intensified after his death in 1968. He became the subject of books, movies, and television shows, most of which took significant liberties with the actual facts of his life. The Godfather of Harlem television series that premiered in 2019 presented a dramatized version of Bumpy's life that captured some truths while inventing many details. The character of Bumpy Johnson appeared in the film American Gangster, played by Denzel Washington, though that movie focused more on Frank Lucas and presented a somewhat simplified version of Bumpy. Various biographies and historical accounts have tried to document the real Bumpy Johnson, but sources often contradict each other, and many events in his life are impossible to verify with certainty. What remains clear is that Bumpy Johnson was a significant historical figure who left a lasting impact on Harlem, on organized crime, and on American culture more broadly. The Harlem that Bumpy Johnson took control of in 1928 no longer exists in many ways, but its legacy continues to shape the neighborhood and the broader culture. The buildings where jazz clubs once thrived are mostly gone or transformed into something else. The speakeasies where Bumpy conducted business are long closed. The street corners where he stood talking with associates are now filled with different people living different lives. But Harlem itself remains a vitally important neighborhood, still predominantly black though increasingly diverse and facing challenges of gentrification and changing demographics. The cultural legacy of the Harlem Renaissance continues to influence American art, literature, and music. The jazz that filled Harlem's clubs in Bumpy's era became one of America's most important cultural exports. The literature and art created during that period are studied in universities and celebrated in museums. And the complicated legacy of figures like Bumpy Johnson remains part of how Harlem understands itself. He is remembered by some as a hero who stood up to white mobsters and protected his community. Others remember him as a criminal whose activities brought violence and illegal economies into a neighborhood that deserved better. Both perspectives contain truth. Bumpy operated in a time when legitimate paths to success were largely closed to Black Americans, when the criminal underworld offered opportunities that legitimate society denied, and when the lines between legal and illegal, between oppressor and protector, were blurred by systematic racism and inequality. His story raises uncomfortable questions about how we judge people who break laws in unjust systems, about the relationship between crime and community in neighborhoods that are underserved by legitimate institutions, and about how we remember complicated historical figures who cannot be easily categorized as heroes or villains. Looking back across nearly a century to 1928 and the rise of Bumpy Johnson, we can see a young man who was shaped by impossible circumstances and who shaped his environment in return. He was born into a society that offered him almost nothing, that defined him as inferior because of his race, that closed doors before he could even approach them. He came to Harlem seeking opportunity and found a neighborhood that was vibrant and creative but also desperately poor and controlled by criminals. He chose to become one of those criminals, and through intelligence, courage, strategic thinking, and violence, he rose to control significant power by age 22. The year 1928 was the turning point when Bumpy Johnson went from being just another street criminal to becoming a major force in Harlem's underworld, a position he would maintain through decades of changing circumstances. His story is not simply a crime story or a success story. It is fundamentally a story about race, power, and survival in America. It is about how structural inequality creates environments where criminal enterprises flourish because legitimate opportunities are denied. It is about how communities develop complicated relationships with criminal figures who are both exploiters and protectors. It is about how myths and legends are created around real people, transforming them into symbols that mean different things to different people. Bumpy Johnson took over Harlem streets at age 22 in 1928, and in doing so, he became part of the history not just of one neighborhood but of America itself. His legacy remains controversial, celebrated by some, condemned by others, but impossible to ignore for anyone seeking to understand the complex history of Black urban America in the 20th century. The streets that Bumpy Johnson controlled in 1928 have been walked by millions of people since then. The buildings where he conducted business have housed countless other lives and stories. The criminal empire he built has long since been dismantled or transformed by changing times and new people. But the name Bumpy Johnson still resonates, still carries weight, still represents something important about ambition, resistance, survival, and the complicated nature of power. This is the story of how one young man took control of Harlem's streets and in doing so wrote himself into history. It is a story of darkness and light, of violence and community, of crime and justice, of failure and success all mixed together in ways that resist simple judgment. It is the story of 1928, of Bumpy Johnson at age 22, standing on a Harlem street corner with everything to prove and nothing to lose, looking at the neighborhood around him and deciding that he would control it, no matter what the cost might be. And he did.